Welcome back to the kitchen at Andersen Acres. After several requests, I have decided that yes, indeed, we will make sourdough. Sourdough takes at least a week. I have starter in the fridge, but I thought I would show you the entire process beginning to end. So we will start our starter today, and we will come back and visit it every day for a week to make sure it's thriving and to mix it and things like that. And then we will bake sourdough bread. So the first thing we're going to need is a container large enough to hold at least 6 cups of liquid. You're not going to put that much in it, but it's going to rise over the course of the week and you don't want to run out of room. So don't use anything too small. I'm going to use this now. I will switch my starter into a different container that my starter lives in after we've done this process. But I'm just going to use this for now. So our starter, you have to make it in stages. First, you're going to have to dissolve your yeast. So the first thing we want is about 2 cups of not hot water, not even warm water. You don't want it too warm. If it feels warm when you put the tips of your fingers on it, it's too warm. It should feel barely lukewarm. Okay, so you don't want it cold because that'll kill your yeast, but you also don't want it too warm. The whole point of sourdough is a slow rise, slow fermentation. And you can use your starter for weeks. So 2 cups of lukewarm water. Then we're going to do a heaping teaspoon of traditional yeast. It's really important that you use traditional yeast. You do not want to use quick rise or bread machine. It must be traditional in your sourdough starter. So you're just going to sprinkle that in there. Don't touch it. We're just going to leave it. We're actually going to leave it for a full 5 minutes. So we're going to walk away. Don't touch it. Don't mix it. Don't do anything. You're just going to ignore it for a full 5 minutes. So set a timer and we'll come back in exactly 5 minutes. All right, it has been 5 minutes and our yeast has dissolved quite nicely in our water. Now it's time to complete our starter. I'm going to be using this Danish dough whisk. You can just use a fork or even your fingers if you want, but I find this is perfect for sourdough. So we are going to use that to mix and we are going to add our honey. You only need about a tablespoon of honey, so you don't need a ton. You just need about a tablespoon. Remember, this sits so it has a long time to develop. We're also going to add 3.5 cups of flour. I like to dump it on the edge of the bowl so it doesn't splash because we don't need to splash water and yeast everywhere. So 3.5 cups of flour, 1 tablespoon of honey. Those are your 4 ingredients for your starter. That's all you need. You don't need anything else. We're just going to take our dough whisk. And I like to be gentle with my sourdough because I don't want to break it down. I want air bubbles to form. So every time I come back and stir this, and I'll do that on camera for the next 7 days, when I come back and stir this, we do need it to maintain the air bubbles. Okay, now this is going to be quite wet. That's the point. You'll notice we had 3.5 cups of flour to 2 cups of water. Now, usually when I'm making bread, if you've watched my other videos, you'll notice that I use 1 cup of water to 3 cups of flour. This is really wet on purpose. The wetter it is, now you don't want to add extra water. Don't add more than your 2 cups of water, but the wetter your dough, the wetter your starter, the better it develops. So this is going to develop beautifully because it's quite wet. Now you want to scrape everything off the sides as best you can. It doesn't matter that much, but you do want to get what you can because you want to make sure your flour is fully incorporated. And remember, we're going to come back and do this every day for 7 days. We're going to mix it. We're not going to add anything in those days, but you will see a difference. You will absolutely see a difference day to day as it starts to develop. We are looking for it to have a filmy, almost yellowy layer on top when we come back one day. That usually takes 5 to 7 days to develop. But that's what you want. You want a yellowish layer telling you that it's been fermenting really well. The longer you leave your sourdough starter, the better. All right, so this is looking pretty good. Just going to turn this side in one more time. Okay, that looks looking pretty good. Now what we want to do is we want to loosely cover it. So I'm going to place this lid on, but I'm not going to place it on and snap it down. You don't want to snap it down. You need airflow. If I were to snap this down, about 36 hours from now, the whole thing would explode. We don't want that. So gently place that on top. All right, gently. Now we're going to put this somewhere warm and out of the way. So I'm going to put it in the cupboard above the microwave. Do not put it in the fridge. It will not develop properly if it's in the fridge. So we're going to stick it in the cupboard and we're just going to ignore it for 24 hours. Tomorrow we will come back and give it a stir, and we're going to do that once every day for 7 days. So we'll come back tomorrow. All right, so our starter has been sitting for 24 hours. That's how it should look after 24 hours. We are not ready to use it yet. So we're going to take our Danish dough whisk and we're just going to pull that dough off the sides and we're going to give it a mix. We're not going to add anything. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to pull our dough off the sides. Just like this, you're going to pull and get the air out, but you're going to be gentle, okay? See that? You want it to look like that. So you want to be gentle with your dough. Gently. Because you want to get that air out, but you don't want to completely reset it. See how nice that looks? So you want to get that air out. Just kind of fold it over itself and let it fall gently. So this is day 1. We have to do this for a week. So we will come back tomorrow and do this again. See, we've kind of punched it right down there. Good for us. Turn it over a few times. This is why you have a Danish dough whisk, because they work really well for sourdough. This is so much easier than using a spatula, and it doesn't stick as badly, because look at that. That is very, very sticky. So we wouldn't want to use a regular spatula because it'll be very difficult. So that's about it. We are going to cover it again, and then we're going to wait another 24 hours. We're going to come back tomorrow and do this again. See you tomorrow. Well, welcome to day 2. It's been another 24 hours. Let's see how our sourdough starter looks. There we go, getting nice and bubbly. So again, we want to take our Danish dough whisk and we just want to move it through the dough. See how it's getting quite bubbly, but it doesn't have that yellow film I talked about. So it is not ready. In fact, it won't be ready for a few more days. So we're just going to use our Danish dough whisk to remove some of the air. Be gentle. Okay, be gentle. You don't want to destroy your starter by schmucking the heck out of it. You just want to move it around so that it can get some of that air knocked out of it gently. Okay, so we just scrape and move through the dough with our Danish whisk here. This is what we love. It looks good. All right, now we're going to recover it. Again, not tightly. You do not want it tightly covered. You want it loosely covered. So when I put this lid on, I don't snap the lid down. I just rest it on top. So we're going to loosely cover it, and then it's going to go back in the cupboard. It is not ready for the fridge. If you put it in the fridge, you're going to retard its growth. So we're just going to put it in the cupboard again and ignore it for another 24 hours. So it has been yet another 24 hours for our sourdough starter. Let's take a look. It's getting good. It smells pretty good. Remember, it should start to smell very sour. So we're just going to mix it with our bread whisk again. Get everything, the air out. Not all of the air. That's why we use this whisk, because it still allows quite a lot of passage through the dough. And this should get really almost slimy. I know it doesn't look appetizing, but this is how you make sourdough. Sourdough is a delicious bread, but sometimes the process of getting there is a little ick. So this is looking pretty good. We are going to cover it again, and we're going to come back and check it tomorrow. Set a timer. Set an alarm on your phone. Every 24 hours, you have to check it. You have to mix it. You've got to work it a little bit, not a ton, but you have to do it every 24 hours. If you forget about it for 3 or 4 days, you got to start all over again. So this is just getting our starter ready. Once our starter is ready, it will be able to live in the fridge, but now it's got to live in the cupboard. So we're going to recover that and come back again tomorrow and see how it's looking. Well, it has been yet another 24 hours for our sourdough starter. Again, our lid is loosely fit. You do not want to trap the air in there. You can see it's getting bubbly. It's starting to get a film on top. That's what you want. So we're just going to take our dough whisk and we're just going to give it a stir. Get right to the bottom. Make sure everything's mixed up. You don't want to be too rough. We're just giving it a stir. You can see it's bubbly. That's fantastic. Give it a good stir. That's why we use a dough whisk. All right, so we are going to cover it and set it aside yet again for 24 hours. Like I said, this is going to take a week. So I started this dough on a Thursday. I started the starter on a Thursday. The earliest we're going to have sourdough bread is Wednesday evening. So we're going to set this aside again for another 24 hours. You see how gooey it's getting? That's really good. This is what you want. You want it to be gooey. So we're going to set this aside for yet another 24 hours and we will come back tomorrow and we'll check on it again. Join me then. All right, so our sourdough has been sitting another 24 hours and let's take a look. Oh, it's looking good now. Look at that. Oh, it's looking just divine. So we're just going to stir it again. And this is going to be the last time we do this before we bake bread. The next time we come back, which will be in about 24 hours, we are going to start using this to bake because I can tell just by looking at it now, that is definitely ready. It'll be excellent by tomorrow. So we're going to just put this back in the cupboard one more time, but we are going to bake it up next time, I promise. It's going to be just delicious. It smells excellent now. So we'll see you in another 24 hours. All right, well, our starter is almost a week old, and it does have a film on top, and it should be quite liquidy now. I know it looks more liquidy than when we started. That's supposed to happen. It should have some bubbles in it, because there's yeast in there, and if you've been stirring it every day, it should be active. So now our starter is ready. We can actually move on to making our dough. I know we've been doing this for a week, and it seems like a drawn-out process, and it kind of is, but that's okay. Now we're going to do this by hand because the bread maker, you can do it, but this has to, after we make a dough, it has to sit for 8 hours, sometimes 10 hours before it really develops. And I don't want my bread maker occupied that long. So I'm just going to mix it by hand. It's not really that big a deal. You can absolutely do this in your bread maker if you want. I'm not going to. All right, so what we do is first, this is going to get gooey, so take any jewelry off. If you have longer sleeves, roll them up. You don't want stuff on your hands and your sleeves and your jewelry and everything. So the first thing we need to make our dough is we're only going to take a half cup of our starter. Okay, so make sure it's really well stirred up because you want all that goo. You want it really nice and gooey. So I like to take my bowl over top of the other bowl just because it gets really difficult to handle and it'll drip. So half a cup of that starter. Half a cup. Okay. There we go. Half a cup of starter. To that we're going to add 1/8 of a cup of sugar. Okay, this is where I grab my dough whisk because that sugar will help that yeast rise. We're not putting any actual yeast in our dough. Remember, this starter had yeast in it, and it's been developing for a week. This is a much slower rise. See, it's bubbling already. Adding the sugar like that does cause it to bubble. See? You can see those bubbles in there. They're starting to pop. So you want to wait till that happens. That may take a few minutes. My starter's really quite active, so it happened really fast. But you can see bubbles are rising to the surface and popping. That means your starter is active. After you add the sugar, that should happen. All right? So you add the sugar, give it a mix, and then see if you have air bubbles that rise to the surface and pop. See? They're going. You might not be able to see it well on camera, but it is happening. Okay. Next, take our dough whisk out. We don't need that anymore. Okay, now we're going to add 2 tablespoons of butter. Okay, we're going to add 1 cup of water, not cold water, should be slightly warm. And we're going to add 3 cups of white flour. And on top of that flour, we're going to add 1 teaspoon of yeast. No, salt. I always say yeast. Why do I do that? It's salt. It's not yeast. We're not adding any yeast to this. That's salt. Okay? So 1 teaspoon of salt. Now we're going to get our hands in there. Just start mushing. You want to make sure that starter's at the bottom. Get it. You want that starter to get in here. And you should be able to smell your starter. It'll smell quite sour. It's actually quite a nice scent. Not a horrible sour, not like soured milk or anything like that. It actually smells really nice. So we're just going to work it in the bowl. There's no real technique here. There's just, smash it around till it gets kind of consistent. See? Just want to do that. Scrape down the sides of your bowl. There we go. It's looking pretty good. Yeah, see, it should form a nice dough. So we're going to put that on our mat. And we're just going to use our fingers to scrape some of this out of the bowl. There we go. Now we're going to just start kneading. See, our butter, we want to smash our butter into that because you want the butter. You do want to use butter. Don't use margarine. For some reason, it doesn't rise as well when you use margarine. So you want to use butter in your sourdough. So you just start kneading. Do not add any extra flour. It should be quite damp. Okay, you see it's kind of damp and sticky. That's actually really normal. Do not add extra flour. You don't want this to be a tough dough. It needs to have the smooth elasticity, the dampness to rise. And don't worry about it being too wet to hold its shape because we're going to actually let it rise in a proofing basket. I'll show you that after this will be technically its first rise, even though the starter has been rising for a while. Yeah, see, it even sticks to my silicone mat. That's good. You want it to. So if it's doing that, you just pick it up, turn the wet parts to the inside, the wettest parts, but it should be, see, it should stick like this. It should be quite damp, and that's a good thing. It should be quite a damp dough. And so, see, it's normal for it to pull like that. You want damp. Sourdough should not be a drier dough. It should be quite sticky, quite damp. So we don't want to knead for too long because that's not the kind of dough this is. And the longer you knead, the stickier it gets. This is all good. You want it to be leaving those trails. If it's not leaving those trails, then you're not quite getting the dough you want. You can almost knead this in your hands as well. I do this a lot with these kind of doughs. You just kind of turn it over and you're almost kneading in your hand. You're just kind of turning and pushing in your hand. This doesn't need that much kneading. Okay, this dough, the starter's been sitting a week. The dough is going to develop quite nicely. So after you have a dough that's about like that, again, it should be damp. Okay, you can wipe down your hands if it's annoying you the way it sticks, but this one doesn't really need much help. Now this is a looser dough, so you want to rise it in a bowl. So we're just going to bring this bowl back. Just going to roll this bowl along the edges because it will pick up any of the last little bits. Okay, you don't need your bowl particularly clean. This is just going to do its first rise because technically this is the dough's first rise. It really is. Even though the starter's been rising a week, this is the first time we've had a dough. So you just kind of put it in the bottom there, and we're just going to cover it loosely. Cover it loosely. Set it aside somewhere warm to rise. So I'll just let you look at that dough again before we cover it. But set it somewhere warm to rise for, seriously, it's going to be about 8 hours. It's going to be a long time. Okay, so you're going to need to let it rise for about 8 hours. Long time. Don't bother it before then. Check it. It should have about doubled in size. If it hasn't, give it another 2 hours. So you could be doing this all day. It's kind of good to do this part at night because then at night, it's not that big a deal because you just go to bed. Check it in the morning. You really can't let it rise too long, right? Even if you let it rise for 16 hours, it's still going to be doing its thing. That's kind of the point of sourdough. So at least 8 hours. So right now here, it's about 5 a.m. So this is going to be rising well into the afternoon. Okay, so we might be able to make sourdough tonight. It's literally a long, drawn-out process. So we'll come back and look at it in 8 to 10 hours. We might have to leave it longer than that. I don't think so. This is a pretty active starter. It's a brand new starter, so it's really quite robust. But we will check, and we'll leave it longer if we have to. So we'll see you again in 8 to 10 hours. All right, so our sourdough has been rising for 8 hours. Look at that. Look at how nice that is looking. It's actually perfect. That's what you want it to look like after it's been rising. That will take 8 to 10 hours. So we're just going to set that aside for a second. And we're going to get, this is our proofing basket. Okay, we can either use it with the liner or without. If you want this cool pattern on your bread, you would take the liner out. But I actually want a smooth top. So we're going to put the liner on. And then what we're going to do, we're going to make sure the liner is right at the top. Okay, so we just go around, work your liner up so that it's right at the top. You don't want it popping off, but you want it right at the top, all the way around, because you want it to go down into the form. Okay, this is a proofing basket. It's going to make our sourdough nice and pretty. Now I have 2 of these, and I am going to get the second one. It's just in the cupboard here, but we're going to do essentially the same thing. I'm not going to make you watch both. We're just going to do the same thing with both of them. So we take this, we're going to take a little bit of flour, get that flour in there. Now you're just going to rub the flour. Now the reason to use a proofing basket is because it gets it wicks the moisture away. Okay, these baskets pull the moisture out away from your dough, which is good because it's a very wet dough. You've seen that over the course of the last few days of mixing and stirring. It's a very wet dough. So what we're going to do, we are going to take off any jewelry you have on your hands, and we're going to turn this out onto our mat. Okay, don't be too rough with it. You don't want to knock all the air out. Okay, so we're just going to gently manipulate it. See, it's not as wet as it was. It does dry over time, but it's still quite a damp dough. So we're going to take our slicer. This dough does not like to be torn. It likes to be handled gently. Okay, there we go. So we're just going to gently roll this away. Now for shaping our dough, we take our basket, we take this guy. You can do both in one if you like, if you want, but I'm probably going to divide it into 2. Okay, so you take it like this, and you just roll it gently in your hands, gather at the bottom gently. You don't want to be too rough with this dough. Now you're going to put it smooth side down, because this is going to be the top. So the top of our dough goes into the proofing basket. Okay, drop it right in there. We're going to do the same with this other one. I'm just going to grab my other proofing basket and do the same thing. I am going to make you watch both, because why not? So again, we prep our basket by pulling the liner up. Actually, so you can see what it's going to look like, I'll do this one without the liner. How's that sound? Again though, you want to take some flour. Get that flour in there, just because it'll stick if you don't. You don't need to do anything else. Do not spray this with a cooking spray under any circumstances. It's a terrible idea. What happens if you put cooking spray on here? You've ruined your basket. You don't want oils and stuff touching your basket. So, now that you've done that, see, this is a sticky dough, so you want to use your scraper. There we go, to get it off your mat. Otherwise, you're going to leave a lot of residue. So again, same thing. Push your dough up, turn it inside out. Smooth side, straight down. Okay, smooth side, straight down. Nice and flat. Do not push it into the forms. You're just going to want to set them like that. Now you're going to want to take those and just put them in a warm, humid environment. I'm going to use the inside of the microwave just because it's a safe spot and the cats can't walk on them. But you can put them just on your counter with a damp tea towel over them. Just keep them moist because it's still a very damp dough and you want to keep them moist. So we're going to set them aside. It's going to take 2 to 4 hours for them to rise. I know it sounds like it's taking forever to make sourdough. That's because it does take forever to make sourdough. This is not a dough you whip up in an afternoon. So we'll come back and we'll check on them in 2 to 4 hours, depending on how long it takes them to rise. So while we were off camera, I actually made a second batch because I wanted to show you how you shape it if you don't have proofing baskets. Because not everybody does, and you actually don't need them. I just like using them. Okay, so you take your dough. This is my second batch. So I do have the first batch sitting in the proofing baskets. So the first thing you do is punch the air out. So this dough has received exactly the same treatment. It sat for 8 hours to rise. It's sourdough. So that's why it's sticky, right? Sticky, because it's sourdough. So this has received the same treatment. So before you do anything, punch it down is what they call it, but I just squish the air bubble out. Get the air out of it. Use your scraper because it's going to be sticky. So use your scraper to get it off your mat or your cutting board or whatever you're using. Pick it up. You're going to form it into, now this one I'm not going to divide in two. I'm going to do one big loaf. I prefer smaller loaves, but you can use the entire thing and make one big loaf. So you want a smooth top, so you kind of smooth it out and turn it inside out, gather it at the bottom. This is your bottom. Okay, in the proofing baskets, we put good side down. Without a proofing basket, you want good side up. So you're just going to let it sit, just like that. And you're going to let that rise for 2 to 4 hours, just like the other ones. It'll take the same amount of time. It will spread out more, simply because it doesn't have the form of a proofing basket. But that's fine. The proofing basket ones also do tend to spread out more. That's why sourdough loaves tend to be a little shorter and not quite as tall, because they spread more than they go up. So this will spread out as it rises. So we're going to give this one the same treatment as the two individual ones, and it's just going to go away for 2 to 4 hours, and then we will bake it up. So our sourdough has risen. Now it's taken about 4 hours. You might want to give it as long as 6 hours if you need to. Don't rush your sourdough. It will rise, it just rises a lot slower. So you see they both look pretty good. Now what we have to do is actually the trickiest part. You thought waiting a week was bad. We have to turn these guys out onto these pans. You have to be really careful. It's really easy to deflate. So what I do is I put my hand under it, and if you floured everything correctly, put your hand under it when you turn, and let it kind of just, mine's stuck a little bit, which happens. It's not that big a deal. Sometimes when you don't use the liner, you end up with some sticking. I actually ended up with quite a bit of sticking on this one. I didn't use enough flour. That happens to all of us. So you just pull it out. Just pull it out. And just place it on top gently. You don't want to deflate your entire thing. So this one won't be that pretty because I deflated it and I didn't flour it enough. This one, oh, this one's going to come out easier. There we go. Just lay them. Now, to clean these, this you let dry, scrape off all the dough, shake it out really well, and put it back. This you need to let dry 100%. Do not get this wet. Okay, you need to scrub this out with a stiff wire brush. My proofing baskets came with stiff wire brushes to clean them. You must let them dry 100%. Never get these wet. Just let them dry, scrape the dough out with your stiff brush. Okay? Same with this. You got to let this dry to let this little edge come off. Don't try to rush your baskets. Be patient. So these, they will puff up again in the oven easily. They will quickly puff up. This one looks better. Has a little crisscross because of the pattern on the liner. This one, again, it's stuck. It's not that big a deal. Hopefully you flour them better than I did that time. I didn't put enough flour on the bottom of the basket. So extra flour on the baskets. What we're going to do is we're going to pop these in the oven at 400 degrees for 30 minutes. You don't want to cook them less than that. You can cook them up to 40, but do not cook them less than 30. You do want them to get quite cooked. So pop them in the oven gently. They will puff up again. So we'll come back in about a half hour and see how they did. So our larger dough has also risen. that's about as good as it's going to get, about the same amount of time as the smaller doughs. It doesn't really matter how big your dough is when it comes to time. So this one I'm just going to score. I didn't score the other ones, but I'm going to score this larger one. I'm just going to do a basic pattern. You can do any pattern you like. You can do swirls, whatever. It doesn't matter. So I'm just going to score it so you can see what a scored one looks like when it's baked. I'm going to jump over the middle. Just like that. You can do any pattern you like. Okay, now it's going to go in the oven. Again, 375, 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere in there. Usually 400 is better, but check your oven. So do a test run with your oven. About 30 minutes at 400 degrees is usually about right, no matter the size of the loaf. You might want to add 5 minutes if you do a very, very large one. This won't need an extra 5 minutes. This is a double batch, but I've seen people do a triple or even quadruple batch. That might need an extra few minutes. So we will come back and take a look at this one as well. So our sourdough bread is finished rising. Now I do like to make these smaller ones because I like to cut just one and then cut the other one, but you can also make larger ones if you like. You can make any size you like. You can use proofing baskets, but you don't have to. You see, we do have still a bit of a spiral pattern on this one, despite the fact that my flouring wasn't as good as it should have been. So this one does still have a bit of a spiral. Either way, they taste delicious. So I'm just going to slice into this one so you can see what they look like. Now they're very hot. They came out of the oven just a few minutes ago. Ow. So they're still very hot. It's a good idea if you let them cool more than I did before you cut them, because you will burn your hand. But that is our sourdough. It's delicious. The longer you let them bake, the better. These were in for about 35 minutes because that's how much I like them. But don't go over 40 minutes unless you're baking larger ones. So that's your sourdough bread. You would think that we're done talking about sourdough, but we're not. We're going to have to do a segment, 2 segments still, on what to do with your starter, because we're not going to trash it, not after a week's worth of work. So come back and we'll talk about that starter. And that is the full-size loaf. So this was made using the entire batch of dough, the entire half cup of starter makes this size. Now you can divide it into any amount you want. You can divide this into 2 like I did with the other ones, or you can divide it into 4, 6, 8, or even more if you want smaller individual portions. Sourdough dough is actually really versatile. So that's the full size. All right, so we have this sourdough starter. It's a week old now. Okay, so it has been sitting. And now it worked perfectly well for our small sourdough loaves, and they're perfectly delicious. I know, because I ate the piece I cut off. But what you now have is this starter. What do you do with it? You can't just leave it on your counter forever. It will eventually die. So you either have to feed it or replenish it. Now, if you're going to replenish it, you have to have removed 1 cup of starter. We only removed half a cup. So we're not going to be able to replenish it. So instead, we're going to feed it. So if we're going to feed our yeast, we add a teaspoon of honey. Just 1 teaspoon of honey. There we go. First, we bring it out of the fridge, because this is going to live in the fridge now. But we bring it out of the fridge, let it warm up, add the honey, let it sit for 12 hours on the counter, return it to the fridge. That keeps your starter fed. Okay, you have to do that at least once a week. Okay, that's really important. You can't just leave your starter to go bad. So now you can stick it in the fridge and take it out again when you need it. You have to do that once a week. Feed it or use it. If you use it and you remove 1 cup of starter, so you make 2 batches of dough instead of 1, or 2 larger sourdoughs. I like smaller ones. You might want a larger sourdough, and that's totally valid as well. So you have to feed it. If you do remove 1 cup of starter, then what you will be able to do is replenish. And we'll talk about replenishing in the next segment. Right this second, we are just feeding it. So now that we've fed it, we'll take the dough whisk out. We'll snap the lid on and stick it in the fridge after we've waited 12 hours for the honey to incorporate. So, for example, it's 6 p.m. right now. At 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, I can put that away in the fridge for a week. You can now at this point snap the lid on tight as long as you remember to burp it once a week. You must take the lid off and let the gases escape or it will blow up. Okay, it absolutely will. So I like to make it a habit on Sundays and Wednesdays to just make sure that I pop the lid just to let any gases out, then I never have a problem. But you absolutely need to make sure you let those gases out. So put a reminder on your phone, set a schedule, whatever you need to do, you do it. So now we're just going to set this aside for 12 hours, then stick it in the fridge, then we'll use it again next week. In the next segment, we will talk about actually replenishing our starter. All right, so one last thing about your starter. So you've got your starter. Maybe you fed it and kept it alive, but every time you take a half cup out, just for your recipe that I gave you, you have a less and less starter. So what are you going to do? So I've made 2 batches, so I took 1 cup total out of my starter. Now, you can do a couple of things. You can throw it out. Please don't. Do not throw out your starter. It's actually fantastic. And the longer you keep your starter, the more intense the flavor of your sourdough will be. So instead of doing that, we are going to replenish it so we can keep this infinitely. You can keep it for years. Okay, I have a starter in my fridge that I've had for 8 years now, and it's fantastic. You can have them for a long, long time. So let's replenish this instead of chucking it. So I did make 2 batches of dough, so I removed 1 cup of starter. So every time you remove 1 cup of starter, you can add back enough material to keep your starter going. So to do that, we've removed 1 cup of starter, remember, so we've done 2 batches of dough. So we are going to add 1 cup of flour, 2/3 of a cup of water, and 1 teaspoon of honey. Okay? Just a teaspoon. You don't need more than that. You just want to get enough in there that you rejuvenate your yeast. So then we're going to mix that in. Use your dough whisk. Get it going. Mix it till it's quite well mixed. You don't want to miss any. Okay, so then after you've got this mixed, what you're going to do, here we go. What you're going to do is leave it on the counter for 12 hours or in a cupboard. Do not put it in the fridge yet. For 12 hours or until it's frothy. Then give it a mix. Okay, mix it, stick it in the fridge. You can leave your starter in the fridge until about 12 hours before you use it, 12 to 24, depending on the temperature in your home. So if you keep your home pretty warm, you're probably fine with 12 hours. If your home is kept quite cool, then you might need to let your starter warm up for 24 hours. So there we go. That's looking good. So we're going to leave this alone for 12 hours or overnight, and then we will put a lid on it and put it in the fridge and keep it until next week. So I make 2 batches of sourdough a week at minimum. So I'm replenishing at least once a week. I do not have to feed my starter because I replenish. You don't have to do both. You don't have to both feed and replenish your starter. Okay, if you took 1 cup of starter out, you can replenish as I've just shown you. If you took less than 1 cup of starter out, then you just feed it, one or the other, once a week. Set an alarm on your phone, because if this starter goes completely untended, then it kind of goes dead. It can be rejuvenated, but it kind of goes dead. So you can put this in an airtight container, just like you can when you feed it. Not for the first 12 hours. When it's developing, leave the lid off. But after it's developed and it's in your fridge, you can put a lid on and snap the lid down. Just make sure you let the air out once or twice a week. I do it twice a week. You might only do it once a week. But the longer you keep this starter, the more delicious it's going to be. So, with that said, that's all that we need to know about our starter. So that was making sourdough bread. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll try this at home. I know it takes a long time, but you can preserve your starter so it doesn't take quite as long. It only takes about 24 hours the second time you do it because your starter's already ready. So thanks for joining us here in the kitchen today. If you want to keep up to date on more of our baking and indeed all our happenings here at the farm, don't forget to subscribe. See you tomorrow.